Florence Addington, a celebrated theatre actress from London, was admitted to Asylum Blackwood after a public incident that culminated in hysterical screams during a performance of her latest play. The event, witnessed by a packed audience, began when Florence interrupted her lines on stage and fixed her eyes on an empty spot in the audience. Seconds later, she began to scream, pointing at the crowd and repeating, "They have no faces. Why are they watching me?" Her reaction caused widespread panic, leading to her removal from the stage and subsequent hospitalization. Preliminary reports indicate that Florence had been experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations for weeks, frequently reporting incessant applause that pursued her even in the silence of her home. These episodes were accompanied by growing paranoia and an obsession with reflections, which led to the destruction of all the mirrors in her dressing room. According to Florence, her reflections stopped being herself. Florence's symptoms began after a highly successful theatrical season, during which she played Persephone in a play inspired by the Greek myths of the underworld. Interestingly, historical records from the asylum reveal that the play had been presented years earlier at the local Brookhaven Theatre by an amateur troupe, some of whom mysteriously disappeared after the end of the season. This detail, though dismissed by the doctors as mere coincidence, was mentioned in informal conversations between the staff at the asylum. During her initial evaluation, Florence remained cooperative, but her accounts were unsettling. She described visions of infinite audiences watching her as she slept. "They never blink," she said, "and their hands never stop clapping." Her narrative often returned to the figure of a woman in the center of the audience, an entity she called the conductor of applause. Florence claimed that this figure led the rest of the silhouettes, who remained motionless but emanated an overwhelming presence. The doctors classified her symptoms as auditory and visual hallucinations, possibly induced by extreme exhaustion and psychological stress. However, there were inexplicable elements that challenged this explanation. During her first night of admission, Florence was found sitting on her bed, staring intently at a corner of the room. When asked what she was seeing, she simply replied, "They are here too. They clap, but they never smile." In the weeks that followed, Florence's case would reveal disturbing aspects that transcended any known diagnosis. Her initial words would prove prophetic: "The stage never closes. We are all on it, all the time." During the first week of admission, Florence Addington demonstrated externally controlled behavior, interacting politely with the nurses and answering the doctor's questions clearly. However, her speech revealed a disturbing subtext. Florence frequently mentioned hearing echoes of applause, but always with a distant and troubled expression. Although it initially seemed harmless, the doctors noticed that she hesitated before stating, "The applause is not for me. They are for someone else who is there, but hasn't appeared yet." Tension escalated on the second night. Around 3 a.m., Florence was found standing in the center of her cell, staring at the opposite wall with her eyes fixed. She seemed completely oblivious to the presence of the nurses until she began clapping slowly and deliberately. The sound of her palms seemed amplified, echoing through the corridors in a way that defied the acoustics of the environment. When asked about her behavior, Florence responded with a serene tone, "They asked for an encore. And who am I to deny them?" The doctors quickly recognized a pattern. Florence's episodes intensified between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. During these hours, she frequently refused to lie down, claiming that if she closed her eyes, the faces of the audience would begin to form. "They never blink," she whispered. "And when they look at me, I feel they already know the end of the play." She exhibited compulsive behavior, covering her face with her hands in frantic movements, while tremors ran through her body. During a session with Dr. Aldous Crane, Florence made one of the most disturbing statements: "They are not here to watch. They are here to remind me that I never left the stage." We never leave." After this remark, Florence remained in absolute silence, staring at her hands as though they were no longer hers. Florence's hallucinations seemed to interact with the environment of the asylum in inexplicable ways. Nurses reported hearing distant applause in the corridors near her cell, even when they were empty. One of the nurses, during a night inspection, said they felt a deep chill as they passed by Florence's cell, as if something invisible were following their steps. In the third week, reports became even more sinister. Florence began murmuring entire dialogues from plays no one recognized. These texts included fragments in unknown languages, which the doctors initially attributed to glossolalia. However, a translator consulted later stated that some of the words referenced fragments of archaic rituals of Greek origin, associated with theatrical cults. In another incident, during a supervised walk in the asylum gardens, Florence approached a group of patients and began clapping vigorously. The gesture provoked a violent reaction from one of the patients, who screamed, "Stop! They will find us." Florence only smiled and replied, "They never sleep. They are already here." The patient was found the following morning in their cell, curled up in a fetal position, mumbling incoherent phrases about the stage that never fades. Florence's episodes began to manifest physically in more disturbing ways. She avoided any reflection, covering the mirror in her room with a sheet. However, on one occasion, a nurse found Florence standing before a window, staring at her own reflection with a look of terrified fascination. When questioned, Florence replied, "I just wanted to see if she had already taken my place." The climax of these events occurred during a storm. The electricity in the asylum was interrupted, and Florence was found kneeling in her cell, with her hands and shoes soaked. The odor in the room was described as a mix of salt and something old, like shipwrecked wood. Florence, in an ecstatic state, repeated a single phrase, "The curtain has fallen, but the final act has not ended." The following morning, Florence presented open wounds on the palms of her hands, as though she had rubbed the skin until it bled. When asked about the injuries, she responded calmly, "I applauded until they knew I was ready." Nurses continued to hear sounds of applause coming from her cell, even on nights when Florence had been sedated. In the fourth week, Florence began describing a specific figure among the audience, a tall woman, wrapped in a dark cloak, with pale hands leading the applause. "She doesn't need a face," Florence murmured, "because she is the play." The effect of Florence on the other patients became impossible to ignore. Many began showing similar symptoms, including auditory hallucinations and a feeling of being watched. One patient, in a panic attack, screamed, "They don't applaud for her. They applaud because we are the next show." Although the doctors attempted to categorize the symptoms as an extreme form of shared psychosis, the events surrounding Florence and her impact on the asylum were increasingly difficult to explain. What began as isolated murmurs transformed into a phenomenon that seemed to consume not only Florence's mind but the very space around her. The following night, something even more unsettling occurred, sealing the fate of Florence and those who dared to watch her for too long. The fourth week of Florence Addington's stay marked the complete collapse of the logic that had previously governed her case. Her episodes, which had once occurred intermittently, became incessant, as though she had been consumed by an endless performance. On the first night of that week, the nurses reported hearing a rhythmic sound coming from her cell. The cadence was precise, resembling a sinister metronome, applause interspersed with mathematically perfect intervals of silence. When the nurses opened the door, they found Florence sitting on the floor, deliberately clapping her hands, her eyes fixed on an empty corner. She seemed not to notice their presence until one of the nurses asked what she was doing. Florence stopped abruptly, lifted her gaze, and whispered, "The scene isn't over yet." Her tone carried an almost supernatural serenity, but her expression conveyed a chilling emptiness. The following night, the phenomenon escalated to a point that could no longer be ignored. A nurse, during her night shift, found Florence outside her cell, standing in the corridor. The door, bolted shut, showed no signs of being tampered with. Florence, however, appeared calm, as if this were entirely normal. "They gave me the exit to the stage," she explained before slowly walking back to her cell and lying down in bed without another word. Florence's behavior began to affect the other patients in a tangible way. During a group therapy session led by Dr. Aldous Crane, Florence suddenly stood up and began reciting a monologue in a language no one recognized. Her voice alternated between deep and high tones, as though different people were speaking through her. The intensity was so overwhelming that one patient collapsed to the floor, unconscious, while another began shouting frantically, "Make her stop. She's calling for them." Dr. Crane decided to isolate Florence completely, arguing that her presence triggered psychotic episodes in the others. However, isolation brought no relief. Staff reported that her cell seemed to exude an oppressive energy. Shadows appeared to move on the walls, even when there was no light. Indistinct murmurs, impossible to locate, filled the nearby corridors. Worse still, the applause continued. On the most terrifying night, Florence was found standing on her bed, arms raised as if she were about to perform for an invisible audience. Her expression was one of absolute ecstasy. Her words were recorded by a nurse who witnessed the event. "They are ready for the final act. I am merely a reflection of what has always been." Suddenly, all the lights in the asylum went out, plunging the place into total darkness. At that moment, the nurses reported hearing the sound of applause echoing throughout the building, growing in intensity until it reached a deafening volume. Some described the sound as coming from hundreds of hands clapping at once, each applause carrying a weight that seemed to crush the air. When the lights returned, Florence had disappeared. Inside her cell, the staff found only her clothes, soaked in a salty substance with a pungent, ancient smell, reminiscent of seawater. Her shoes were corroded, as if they had been submerged in acid. The floor, however, was dry, with no indication of how the substance had arrived there. One of the nurses present reported something even more disturbing. He claimed to have seen a figure in the corner of the cell before the lights went out, tall, wrapped in a dark cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure moved its hands slowly, in a gesture resembling applause, but without making any sound. Its hands were pale and disproportionately long, standing out in the darkness. The reports were dismissed by the administrators as stress-induced hallucinations, but other staff members confirmed seeing the same figure on different occasions. The patients reacted even more dramatically. Many began to completely avoid the corridors near Florence's cell. Some claimed they could still hear the applause, even days after her disappearance. One patient, previously known for his calm behavior, began shouting incessantly, "She's on stage now, and we're next." The records in the file end with a note from Dr. Crane, written with unusual urgency. The case of Florence Addington is not just a clinical mystery, it is a window into something that defies our understanding. This place, this asylum, is not merely an institution. It is an eternal stage, and each of us is but an actor waiting for our turn. I fear Florence may have been only the beginning. Although the events of that night were officially closed, the corridors of Asylum Blackwood would never be the same. The incident left the staff stunned, but the true gravity of what happened would only be realized in the weeks that followed, as the applause continued to echo, even when everything should have been silent. The disappearance of Florence Addington remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in the records of Asylum Blackwood. Her cell was sealed after the events of that fateful night, but the echoes of her presence continued to manifest in an unsettling way. Nurses repeatedly reported hearing muffled applause from inside the cell, despite it being completely empty. A salty, metallic smell, similar to the one that had permeated the place on the night of her disappearance, lingered in the nearby corridors, even after multiple cleaning attempts. The few items left behind by Florence, soaked clothes and corroded shoes, were sealed in the evidence room. One of the staff members who tried to examine the items reported a disturbing phenomenon. As he approached the clothes, he heard a distant sound, like the murmuring of a crowd, followed by a feeling that something was watching him. After this incident, the items were sent to the asylum's basement, where they mysteriously disappeared months later. Attempts to trace Florence outside the facility were unsuccessful. Officially, her absence was attributed to an improbable escape, but internally, no one believed she had simply vanished. There was no evidence of how she could have left the cell, much less the building. Dr. Aldous Crane, the lead physician responsible for her case, insisted that Florence's disappearance was not an isolated event but a symptom of something greater that inhabited the asylum. His notes on performative entities were dismissed as delusions and led to his removal from the staff, but his writings continue to circulate among the older nurses, who claim that Crane knew more than he should. The events surrounding Florence's case seemed to have triggered a chain reaction within the asylum. In the following weeks, at least 2 other patients began to display similar symptoms: a sense of being watched by invisible audiences and an extreme aversion to mirrors. One of them was found drawing faceless figures on the walls of his cell, with phrases like "they are waiting" and "we all have our part" written repeatedly. These cases were officially classified as psychogenic imitations, but some doctors admitted in unofficial records that they felt an inexplicable discomfort when dealing with these patients. The final notes in Florence's file include an observation from an anonymous medical assistant. The applause never stopped. It only merged with the silence, filling the empty spaces of this place. Sometimes, I feel as though the entire asylum is a stage, and we, its puppets, are waiting for our moment under the spotlight. Although the entries in the file were closed, the staff avoided the corridor where Florence's cell had been. The shadows that danced on its empty walls seemed to form silhouettes, but no one dared to look for long. Florence Addington became an emblematic figure of the unfathomable mysteries surrounding Asylum Blackwood, a place where the boundaries between the real and the supernatural do not exist, and the inexplicable is a constant. This is just one of many cases that reveal the dark secrets still echoing within Asylum Blackwood. What happened to Florence? And, more disturbing, who or what was truly applauding that night? The corridors of Asylum Blackwood hold secrets that even time has not been able to silence. The applause that echoes through its walls is only the beginning of something much deeper and more disturbing. Subscribe to the channel to follow the upcoming files and explore the dark mysteries that continue to haunt this place. Leave your theories in the comments about what happened to Florence Addington and what really inhabits the asylum. Are you ready to uncover the truth behind these shadows? Then press play, if you dare.